take their seats, please. We'll try and get the meeting rolling. This is November 19th, the regular meeting agenda. We'll have a call to order and the roll call, please.
Mayor Ryan.
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
Commissioner Hay.
Here.
Commissioner Hodges. Here. Commissioner Hopping.
Here.
We'll have a pledge of allegiance and a moment of silence. Will you please stand? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. Next item of business is awards and proclamations.
Item 3.1, the day of November 24th, 2018, as Small Business Saturday in the city of Salina. Valerie Lindenberger, True Betty Boutique, will read the proclamation.
Whereas the government of Salina, Kansas celebrates our local small businesses and the contributions they make to our local economy and community. According to the United States Small Business Administration, there are currently 30.2 million small businesses in the U.S. They represent 99.7% of all businesses with employees in the U.S. and are responsible for 65.9% of net new jobs created from 2000 to 2017. And whereas small businesses employ 47.5% of the employees in the private sector in the U.S., and whereas 90% of consumers in the United States say Small Business Saturday has had a positive impact on their community, and whereas 89% of consumers who are aware of Small Business Saturday said the day encourages them to shop small all year long, and whereas 73% of consumers who reportedly shopped small at independently owned retailers and restaurants on Small Business Saturday did so with friends or family, and whereas the most reported reason for consumers aware of the day to shop and dine at small independently owned businesses was to support their community, and whereas Salina, Kansas supports our local businesses that create jobs, boost our local economy, and preserve our communities, and whereas advocacy groups as well as public and private organizations across the country have endorsed the Saturday after Thanksgiving as Small Business Saturday. Now, therefore, I, Carl Ryan, Mayor of Salina, Kansas, do hereby proclaim November 24th, 2018 as Small Business Saturday, and urge the residents of our community and communities across the country to support small businesses and merchants on Small Business Saturday and throughout the year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any, well, there's Christmas and Thanksgiving, but do you have any special activities you'd like us to know about?
Well, Salina downtown, we've had our first holiday open house is always the first Sunday of November, and our second holiday open house is the first Saturday in December. So December 1st is Salina downtown is gearing up all the merchants to welcome shoppers into the stores for another big hurrah. And we'll have specials and just neat, unique items for gift giving or receiving.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I have a signed version of the proclamation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next item is the Citizens Forum. This is the opportunity for anyone that would like to address the commission on a matter of their choosing that's not on the agenda. If there's anybody that would like to address us, would you come forward, please?
Daniel Eckhoff, 2664 Highland Avenue. Something different today. So as far as I know, our alcohol laws or ordinances here allow liquor sales until 10 o'clock at night. I'm not sure if that's been changed. I know the Sunday change was fairly recent. I originally come from Hutchinson, been in Manhattan, Lawrence, and it's all been until 11. I would just like you guys to consider an item to expand that to 11, the state maximum, get more tax revenue. I get to buy more of what I want. Businesses get more revenue. Workers get more hours. don't really see the reason why it can't be 11 o'clock. So I'd just like you guys to consider that for an item to pass an ordinance to get it to 11. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to address the commission?
Norman Salina, I just got a question. Is the law enforcement training center still going forward? Can you answer that, or should I ask the city manager? I'd like to know what stage it is.
I can give you a quick update. Staff is working on the details of plating and the site plan and working with our planning department, the county, and Mr. Pestinger, the potential seller of the property, to work out the details.
So it's in the planning stages, but it's not a done deal yet then.
Well, right. The next steps would be to finalize the site plan, finalize the land acquisition, and then we'd place the project out for bid for construction. And each of those would involve city commission approval.
That's what I wanted to know. Thanks.
Anyone else that'd like to address the commission? We'll move on to public hearings and items scheduled for a certain time. We have none. There's a consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda, or is there anyone that would like to pull any of these items for discussion?
Mayor Ryan, I move we approve the consent agenda as listed.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes 5-0. Administration.
Item 7.1, second reading, ordinance number 18-10984, authorizing the issuance of senior special obligation revenue bonds, Series 2018A, and subordinate special obligation revenue bonds, Series 2018B.
Mayor and Commissioners, there is an interrelationship between item 7.1 and item 7.5 A, B, and C, so it might make more logical sense to take up this item after you've addressed item 7.5. If you would be willing to entertain an amendment or a postponement to after item 7.5.
Mayor Ryan, I move we postpone consideration of 7.1 on the agenda until after item 7.5.
Second.
Been moved and seconded to move 7.1 to after 7.5. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We will move the item to the later time. 7.2.
Item 7.2, second reading, ordinance number 18-10985, vacating a portion of a 10-foot wide north-south platted alley located south of Elm Street between North Santa Fe Avenue and North 5th Street in the original town of Salina, Saline County, Kansas.
This item was passed on first reading on November 5th, 2018. Since that time, there have been no comments received. Is there anyone from the public that would like to address this item? If not, we'll bring it back here for action. Could we have a roll call, please?
How about we need a motion first?
We have a motion, please.
Mayor Ryan, I move we approve ordinance number 18-10985 on second reading.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Could we have a roll call?
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. That item passes 5-0. 7.3.
Item 7.3, second reading, ordinance number 18-10986, vacating a 20-foot wide east-west alley extending between North Santa Fe Avenue and North 5th Street in the original town of Salina, Saline County, Kansas.
This ordinance was passed on first reading on November 5th, and since that time, no comments have been received. Is there anyone from the public that would like to address this item? If not, we'll bring it back here for action, please.
Mayor Ryan.
Jinx. I move that we approve on second reading ordinance number 18-10986.
Second. Been moved and seconded. We'll have a roll call.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. That item passes 5-0 as well. 7.4.
Item 7.4, second reading, ordinance number 18-10987, changing the zoning district classification from R3 multiple family residential district to PDD planned development district on property addressed as 148 North Oakdale Avenue.
Passed on November 1st, reading of November 5th, and since that time, no comments have been received. Is there anyone that would like to address this item? There being none, we'll bring it back here for action.
Mayor Ryan, I move we approve on second reading ordinance number 18-10987.
Second.
We'll have a roll call, please.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. That item passes 5-0 as well. 7.5.
Item 7.5, authorize mayor to execute the following transferee agreements. 7.5A, resolution number 18-7628, authorizing the mayor to execute the transferee agreement with Salina 2020 Incorporated and the Stiefel Theater for the Performing Arts Foundation. B is resolution number 18-7629, authorizing the mayor to execute the transferee agreement with Salina 2020 Incorporated and the Salina Education Automotive Museum of America Incorporated. And 7.5C is resolution number 18-7630, authorizing the mayor to execute the transferee agreement with Salina 2020 Incorporated and the Barolo Grill JKSK Corporation.
Mr. Schrag?
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. I took the liberty of combining these into one staff report because I think the bulk of the background it relates to all three of them, and then there's some unique circumstances associated with each project. So I hope that's more helpful than confusing. Initially in the background report, I provided an itemization of some of the key steps and actions that have occurred to get to this point. We covered those in greater detail in the study session on November 5th, a couple weeks ago, as well as the action items that were on your agenda on November 5th. But as part of that conversation, it was noted that a final revenue estimate and study was prepared by Development Strategies, which is the city's consultant that we hired to be our third-party objective consultant as it relates to estimating the revenues for the Star Bond project. And that revenue study accounted for all the key increment generators we initially anticipated, which we commonly referred to as the hotel, the alley, and Old Chicago, as well as the additional projects that have been in the conversation and have developed since then. So that revenue study ultimately also includes and accounts for revenue increases by the Stiefel Theater, which would represent an increment in terms of Star Bonds, the Car Museum and the increment generation that it might account for, and Barolo Grill. And so based on that revenue study, then we were able to structure a bond issue and the senior and subordinate bond sizing, and ultimately we're able to find a way to issue those bonds without the need for city backing of either bond issuance. And I acknowledge that 2 weeks ago, and to anyone that had listened in the intervening time, that subordinate bond issuance, the fact that Blue Beacon was willing to purchase those bonds, really kind of carried the day to allow us to get to full funding of the project, as well as avoid the need for city backing of the senior bonds. And so that puts us in a stronger position in terms of the bond structure and the risk that the city had initially contemplated. And I tell you all that because it then relates back to these projects in that they're assumed parts of the revenue study, and they are assumed increment generators that are key to the preliminary offering statement and the bond issuance that we're ultimately trying to authorize as part of the next item, so that we can do Star Bond issuance before year end. So that's how these projects are all interrelated. With respect to Resolution 187628 for the Stiefel Theater, I provided you the initial language from the development agreement that described the Stiefel improvements at the time that we started into this project and negotiated the development agreement. And then I also provided language from the Star Bond plan, and then ultimately language from the transferee agreement, and noted that there has been a difference in terms of the initial intentions and what the plan is today. There was some conversation at the outset about the possibility of an additional theater. We knew all along that was in the basement. Frankly, the code enforcement development strategy or development services side of me kind of foresaw code issues and egress issues, and those came to light. But what I would tell you is that even with the modification in the plan, the development strategies revenue study accounts for that. They revisited the assumptions about increased programming and increased attendance, and so they stand behind the revised numbers in light of the revised project scope. And so you may recall, as part of the original development agreement, the plan was, even though, and I don't want to speak inappropriately for the Department of Commerce, but even though there was a recognition that the historic theaters and the Stiefel Theater generate tourism and economic activity, statutorily they were not identified as a project eligible for direct STAR bond funding. And so the development agreement provided that the city would receive a reimbursement of $9.625 million for part of our cost incurred for the field house, and then we agreed by way of the development agreement to turn around and make $2 million of that available for the Stiefel Theater improvements. And so when we met 2 weeks ago, we went over the graphics and the renderings of the Stiefel Theater project, and they're attached to this staff report. And then I would also point out that the transferee agreement language contemplates that there'll need to be final revisions to those plans, but the ultimate plans and the project will be in substantial conformance with what is Exhibit A to the transferee agreement, which are the documents that are attached to your report. I also then provided kind of that summary information that was provided to you back in January of 2017 as far as who the responsible parties were, the need for transferee agreements, the project description, the financial estimates, and while the percentages may have changed slightly as it relates to kind of the overall performance of the project, essentially the project and the proposal that's before you numerically it matches up with what was contemplated back in January 2017. With respect to the car museum, very similarly, I provided the initial language that was in the development agreement in terms of the description of the car museum project, the STAR plan, a STAR bond plan description of the car museum project, the transferee agreement language. Again, I don't know that there are changes in scope, but it includes the language about the need to finalize plans and the final plans being in keeping in substantial conformance with Exhibit A to the transfer agreement, which are the documents that are attached to the staff report. And then I also provided that summary information that was provided back in January as related to the project description and the different funding assumptions. And again, it was anticipated to be a $4.695 million project. It is the tourism generator that kind of checks the box for STAR bond eligibility. There was a recognition that while private owners of cars that could be displayed would contribute their vehicles, there was not an expectation of private funding of the construction of the museum. That was to be fully funded by STAR bond proceeds in that $4.695 million amount. So I'm repeating myself, but that is the tourism increment that kind of checks the box for STAR bond eligibility for the rest of the project. Then the next resolution, 1876-29, pertains to the Barolo Grill transferee agreement. And at the time that the development agreement was negotiated and we considered all that back in January of last year, there was quite a bit of detail in terms of the development agreement included quite a bit of detail about allocation of different funds funded by tax increment financing and different funds funded by the Downtown Community Improvement District. And so those allocations are itemized in the staff report. But the intention was, it was estimated that tax increment financing would generate $4.8 million of proceeds over the life of the TIF district. Projects would be eligible to be funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. 18.3% of that, or about $800,000, was dedicated to the hotel TIF fund. 21%, or about $920,000, was dedicated to a market rate apartment TIF fund. Another 6.9%, or about $300,000, was dedicated to the Old Chicago TIF fund. and then the remaining 53.8%, or an estimated $2.625 million, was dedicated to new business TIF fund. And so there are parameters both in the development agreement and the supplemental agreement about administration of those funds, application for funding, and the basis on which annual allocations would be made and administered. And then similarly, as it relates to the Downtown Community Improvement District funding, it was estimated that $7.6 million of proceeds would be generated over the life of the Community Improvement District, with 40% of that, or $2.8 million, going to maintenance, security, and programming, with the expectation that we would enter into a transfer agreement with Salina Downtown, Inc., which there's been some conversations, but we've not drafted and negotiated that transfer agreement yet. 1% of that was dedicated to the old Chicago project, and the estimated amount of $50,000. 39.5%, or approximately $3 million, was dedicated to new retail improvements, and 18.9%, or $1.43 million, was dedicated to existing retail improvements. So again, the development agreement and the supplemental agreement provided the language about how those funds were to be set aside, allocated, the application review and approval process, and then ultimately how annual allocations would be made, and they're all on a pay-as-you-go basis, and what might happen if funding wasn't available in any given year. One other thing that I would note is the way that the development and supplemental agreement were set up. The city representative had the authority to review and approve the actual application for funding, and the city representative was designated as the city manager, and so it created a structure where Salina 2020 and the city manager could review and vet applications, yet transfer agreements still come to you as the governing body to execute. And so we've had ongoing conversations about the Barolo Grill, its contribution to the overall Star Bond project, kind of the nature of it being on the leading edge of investing in the downtown, the annual allocations out of the TIF fund and the CID fund, and so we're bringing it to you with the collective recommendation of myself and Salina 2020 for funding as described in the transferee agreement. And while we didn't specifically anticipate the Barolo Grill project, we did identify as part of that 2017 conversation that there would be vacant space and new construction projects by multiple third parties that would require transfer agreements, and we at that time estimated $25.8 million of private investment, use of the $2.6 million of TIF proceeds and the $2.8 million of CID proceeds to kind of leverage an overall $31.2 million of investment in the downtown by way of those dedicated funds. And so we also addressed that we did not anticipate conditions precedent necessarily that were specified in the development agreement, but transfer agreements would address them on a project-by-project basis. So with respect to the Barolo Grill transfer agreement in particular, I included the section, or highlighted the section of the transfer agreement that addresses the public financing proceeds and the conditions, the financing cap, the allocation of funds. So on page 11 of my report, it calls out the TIF proceeds of up to $125,000 and CID proceeds of up to $125,000. And then it goes on later in that same, and then it calls out the fact that they're eligible for 5% interest on fund or eligible costs that are yet to be reimbursed, that it's on a pay-as-you-go basis. And in section E on page 12, it calls out that allocation amounts to $6,250 of TIF proceeds annually and $5,682 of CID proceeds annually. The difference being the CID district term is longer than the TIF term. And so even though they're each $125,000, the annual amount comes out a little bit differently. So combined, the transfer agreement would anticipate $11,932 a year for the Barolo Grill project on a pay-as-you-go basis, assuming that funds are available on an annual basis, subject to the supplemental agreement provisions about what happens when they're not, and also accounting for 5% interest on eligible unreimbursed expenses. So, while the $250,000 seems like a significant amount, it's in recognition of kind of that upfront investment. It's in recognition of the overall investment that's being made in that particular project, and it's essentially $12,000 a year for 20 to 23 years. So to fully realize that full contribution or incentive, the Barolo Grill would have to be up and running and in existence for that duration of time. So I know I've covered the conformance with the strategic plan multiple times with you, and I'd be happy to go into that in detail if you like, but I think this project hits 2/3 to 3/4 of our strategic plan goals in terms of economic development, downtown revitalization, those type of things. With respect to the fiscal note, the Stiefel Theater project is funded with Star Bond reimbursement, so it's not a direct expense out of the city's general fund, and it's anticipated and a commitment that's already been made. The Car Museum project is similarly, it does not hit the city's general fund. It's funded out of Star Bond proceeds, and it's a commitment that's already been made. And the Barolo Grill project is paid on a pay-as-you-go basis with a combination of tax increment financing increment and downtown CID increment. So that increment has to be generated, and it's for a dedicated purpose. It's not hitting our bottom line like a typical contract expense might. So having said all that, with each resolution, the options that we identified for you are that you could approve them as presented, which would authorize the mayor to execute the transferee agreements as presented. You can postpone consideration of any one of the three to a specified date, but we would note the whole goal here has been to make our year-end timeline, and so this has all been a culmination to get to this point. Postponement, we probably would need to discuss with bond counsel what that might look like and what the implications might be for the Star Bond issuance. And you could vote to deny the resolutions. That would result in the city not fulfilling our commitments to as we've already entered into them by way of the development agreement and supplemental agreement, and the additional consequences would flow from there. I haven't itemized those. So having said that, I've just covered 3 projects all at once, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Questions?
Just have one. If the Stiefel were not able to come up with creative ways to use that entire $2 million or bids or less, does that money come back directly to the city, or does it stay with the Stiefel because it's committed that way?
That's a really good question, and I failed to point that out. The Car Museum, there is a certification of expenditure process provided for in the supplemental agreements and the transfer agreements. In the case of the Stiefel and the Car Museum, there's a recognition that the bulk, if not 100% of the projects are funded with these proceeds, but there is a mechanism in place to work with them to receive invoices, demonstrate they've actually incurred the expenses, and then either directly pay those invoices or distribute funds as we confirm those expenses have been incurred. So it would not be a situation where we just turn over all the funds and have to play catch up necessarily.
Thank you.
But if they were to, I'm sorry, just to follow up on that super quick.
Yeah,
So if they were to use like 1.97,
Right.
The $300,000 then basically stays with the city?
Yeah, I would expect at that point we may have to
I'm sure
revisit the
if you
development
have $2
agreement
million,
provisions and talk about agreed upon alternate uses of those funds. And I got it right. Bond counsel agrees, so.
We can dream, can't we?
And I'd ask that we kind of address each one of these separately, because I do have just a couple questions, but it's dealing with the CID and the TIF, and I don't want to confuse the 3, because the first 2 really don't deal with the TIF and the CID. So I'll hold those questions till we get to the 3rd one.
Is there anyone from the public that would like to address any of these items?
Yeah, I failed to mention, city's bond counsel and financial advisor, as well as Salina 2020, are in attendance, so, as well as project representatives. So you've got a handful of people that may be able to help answer questions or wish to address you.
And if they have any remarks they'd like to offer us off camera, the remark was they never come in under budget. So, anyone else like to address these items? If not, we'll bring it back here for action. We could take A first.
Mayor Ryan, I move approval of resolution number 17-7628, authorizing the mayor to execute the transferee agreement with Salina 2020, Inc. and the Steeple Theater for the Performing Arts Foundation.
Second.
Been
Been
moved
moved and seconded.
As a clarification, it's
That's
18
18
7628.
7628.
28.
What did I say?
17.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Little dyslexic here. Thank you.
Been moved and seconded. Is there
18-7628.
any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item passes 5-0. And item B. Is there a motion for item B? Resolution number 187629.
Yes. I move approval of resolution number 18-7629, authorizing the mayor to execute the transferee agreement with Salina 2020, Inc. and the Salina Education Automotive Museum of America, Incorporated.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion on that item? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Resolution 187629 passes 5-0. Item C, Resolution 187630. Is there a motion?
I do have a question on kind of how this all works on the CID and TIF, because I noticed on the TIF money, you know, I think these get kind of paid in order. We have the hotel, and then we had the apartment TIF, and we really don't have anybody signed up for that. So at this point, and then we have the Old Chicago, and then the new business, which would go to Barillo. So as we collect those monies, how does that get paid out if we do not have anyone that's applied for the 21% apartment TIF fund?
There's a little bit of background.
Does that go into a bucket for later, or does everybody just slide down?
Right. The development agreement anticipated some of the key projects and identified that they did not need to make an application for review, consideration, and approval in a competitive manner. So, you know, the hotel, the alley, Old Chicago, those items were kind of those projects were pre-approved in the development agreement. With respect to the apartments, I know we had conversation about, you know, the intent and just that that project was still under consideration, but I guess I'll have to enlist the help of Aaron Martin from Clark Mize Linville to speak to the prioritization of
Good
those
afternoon, Mayor and
projects.
Commissioners. We did anticipate that scenario in the development agreement with Salina 2020. And in the event that for example, the apartment TIF fund never had a use, that money would be redirected to the new business TIF fund for use such as the Barola Grill as it's being used now. So that's what would happen with that particular fund.
So if somebody comes in 5 years and decides to do that, do they get the full effect of the 20 years of collecting the TIF for that?
The TIF will be collected at the outset
Right.
of the creation of the district, but the money will be held until there's a use for
Okay,
it. So
so
if the
it will be
apartments
held,
did not
okay.
construct and there was no use for the apartment TIF, then after a certain period of time or upon mutual agreement with Salina 2020, that money would be redirected to the new business TIF fund.
But until then, that money is not available to our current project. It's being held basically in escrow for the apartment.
Yeah, I think your question
is
relates
whether
to
or
the
not that money can be
prioritization.
used early.
In the
Yeah.
event that the TIF increment is not generated to fully fund the escrow and approved projects, which comes first, the escrow or the approved project? Is that,
Both.
Yeah.
okay?
Both. Which comes first, and does it go down the line? And so if 1/20th of that 920,000, does it get set aside for somebody that could come in 2 years, 5 years, or whatever?
No, it will be the full 920 that could be accumulated in the apartment TIF fund will be held until such time as I'm looking here. The market rate apartments do not move forward as mutually agreed by the city and the master developer would be one example. So that could be for various reasons. But if those did not move forward, if a transfer agreement were not entered into, then that full 920, if it ever got up to that point, or whatever it was short of that, would be rededicated for use on the new business TIF. Does that answer your question?
A little bit, I guess. So I guess, so it's going to be available for somebody to come in and use that at a later date, even though there's nobody initially available from day one.
Yes.
Okay.
That's my
Okay.
read of the 920,000, how it would be preserved and potentially used for a different use if the apartments did not come to fruition.
Yeah, right.
The other question I had dealing with the TIF and with the CID, if the projects are more successful than is anticipated through the financials that have been done, do we pay those individuals, whether it's the hotel or Old Chicago, do they get paid off sooner? Instead of being a 20-year payout, does it become a 15, or do they have to follow the amortization schedule for the full 20 years?
On those other projects, each one is a little bit different. Barolo Grill, for example, is subject to the annual cap of the $6,250. We do have a provision in the supplemental agreement that if there is a surplus of funds that above and beyond what's necessary to pay the Barolo Grill and any other approved developers, then the city and the master developer can agree to pay that out and advance the payment schedule. The others who are on a pay-as-you-go schedule, and I'll look to others in the room if they have any different thoughts, but the others who are on a pay-as-you-go schedule, they're not subject to any annual cap. They're subject to an aggregate limit in how much they can be reimbursed from CID or TIF. But if it all happens in year one, that's great, an accelerated repayment. But I think they were structured to pay out over the course of the district.
And then the side conversation I just had with Bob Johnson with Polsinelli and representing Salina 2020, he reminded me that the first thing that happens is that pro rata allocation to those different pots. So whatever amount does come in any particular year gets allocated on a percentage basis, kind of to that slide that's in the packet. So that happens first. And then within the new business fund is where that prioritization happens from amongst one project and another. So essentially then, regardless of whether there's an apartment project at the moment, whatever that percentage is, 18%, would get allocated into that apartment fund. And then the prioritization of projects would be amongst those in that new business fund.
Okay.
If I could just ask a follow-up question to Commissioner Hoppeck. Is there any length of time that's specified that we're going to hold those monies for the market rate apartments? And I'm sorry if you said it earlier, maybe I missed it, but
Sure.
I mean, does that look like, if it's not moving forward in 2 years, 5 years? I didn't know if there's a point where we say, okay, instead of holding this money, we could actually be directing it toward.
My recollection is that we had that conversation, but we settled on the kind of mutual agreement language amongst the city and Salina 2020 rather than some hard date.
I agree with that. And looking at it, that scenario was just contemplated by a mutual agreement being reached that the market rate apartments are not moving forward. We did not put a date certain.
I didn't know, Commissioner, I didn't mean to
Go
interrupt. Are
ahead.
you finished?
Nope, that's fine.
I just had a couple of questions in terms of the specific allocation amounts. Do we follow a formula or a rubric or anything when we're deciding, 125 from TIF and 125 from the CID? Is there, do we look at that as a percentage of the overall project or the anticipated annual revenues?
Yeah, by way of the development agreement and the supplemental agreement, we did identify kind of goals for the use of those funds, and those were more in terms of developing the market downtown and the selection of products and retailers, those type of things. But we didn't get so specific as to, well, there is one provision that the incentives may not exceed 50% of the project cost, but in this particular instance, we're nowhere near that number. So the things I looked at were the percentage of the project cost as well as the percentage of the overall anticipated funding compared to the request. And this particular request, I think, is about 8%. So it leaves considerable funding for additional projects. So my thinking was they are early adopters. They are helping get us started, so that probably merits a little bit more of an incentive. And part of it's the product selection and what they're offering is complementary to the downtown.
And I think that we probably dealt with this back when we were talking about how the various entities get repaid and how different, by priority and stuff like that. In the instance that a business fails or it's sold, what happens in that case? If Barolo Grill runs its course for 5 years or 10 years or whatever, and is not there, would that transfer to a new business at the same place? If Mom and Pop's Diner were going to open in that place, would that benefit transfer to them, or does it just cease to be?
Well, the transferee agreement specifically includes a section about assignment and transfer of the transferee agreement. And
Yeah, I
then it
couldn't
references
remember.
back to the provisions of the development agreement, and we spent a considerable amount of time sorting through that issue. And Aaron just sat down, but he has the agreement at hand, and I'll ask him if he can speak to it more specifically. I know that we anticipated the possibility of a request for assignment, and it was not presumed.
So on that issue, the development agreement with Salina 2020 addresses that, and there are more restrictive prohibitions on assignment before the project is completed. The thought being we're contracting with this particular entity to construct the project. Once the construction project is completed, the development agreement indicates that a third-party developer, such as the Barolo Grill entity, for example, may freely assign its rights, duties, and obligations under the agreement to any third party with the requisite financial qualifications and capabilities to perform such rights, duties, and obligations. And so a third-party developer must provide 60 days advance written notice to the city and the master developer before any proposed assignment takes place. And then during that period, the city and the master developer will review the financial qualifications and make sure that it's truly a proper substitute that we think can fulfill those obligations to continue the project.
And Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but those rights, and duties, and obligations are the operation of the proposed project as described in the transferee agreement. It wouldn't be a wholesale transition from, one type of business to another, or a significant alteration in that regard.
That's what was anticipated, yes. And so that would include the right to receive the financial incentives as well as the right to conduct the business.
Okay. And just a follow-up question, I think, for Mr. Scragg, lest anyone think that they can just come downtown and start dipping into the pot of money. There are, as you mentioned, requisite financial qualifications. And I know the Barolo Grill ownership structure was set into place just like a day before the packet went out. Has that affected our ability to analyze it from a financial perspective? Or is this something that was undertaken in advance of that incorporation in Kansas?
Well, two things. We were looking at the operators and their past experience, as well as their ability to get financing, and then the definition of commencement in the transferee agreement has another level of detail that they would allow for confirmation that they're under contract, their financing's in place, to even meet the definition of commencement, to meet the requirements of the transferee agreement, and then entitle them to compensation. So in the event that they're not able to fulfill their obligations by way of financing or contracting for construction or renovation, they wouldn't meet the commencement requirements, and they wouldn't be eligible for funding.
So that's when like the financial analysis comes
That's
into
another
play.
opportunity to
Another
confirm.
opportunity.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions?
This is probably a bookkeeping issue, but I see where the transferee name is JKSK Corp. And the current owner of the property is something different. Do we need to address that prior to the transferee agreement being signed?
That was something that bond counsel was made aware of, and I know there's been conversations today about that.
Okay.
Gary Anderson, Gilmore and Bell, and I don't know if there's any representatives Barolo Grill here or not, but our understanding as of this afternoon is that there is one entity that is going to own the property, and there will be a separate entity that will operate. The JKSK Corp. Will be the operator, and that the ownership group is related parties to the operator. I think it's a spouse as a majority owner. So maybe there are some folks here that can further address that. We were just made aware of that this afternoon.
Jeff Mace, Compro Realty, 157 South 7th. I'm here on behalf of the applicant. We have ownership here as well. What he described is just exactly the same is what occurred. Jurong bought the property some 3-4 months ago, and the determination is being made whether they're going to assign the real estate into the newly formed corporation or if it will be a tenant thereof. But either way, we'll either have a lease for bond counsel and or it will be quitclaimed into JKSK. Is the belief right now.
And bond counsel's okay with the lease between the two different entities, I guess would be my question. Okay.
Who do the payments get made to then? I mean, is that all? I mean,
The agreement would be with JKSK, if I have the initials correct. So that payment, and they would be the operator, and then they'd be responsible for lease payments.
One of the conversations that we had, and it might be worth you all thinking about too, is we don't believe that you're required to own the real estate. It could be a tenant environment, but then you're putting forward all the tenant improvement and making the investment and operating the business. So they're making some estate planning / business model decisions around that as we speak, but they'll either be a tenant or own it. But I think going forward, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility to have an applicant in front of you that didn't own the real estate but had a long-term lease. And again, with it being pay as you go, it's working or it's not. So.
And that's why I asked. I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that and that we didn't have any surprises when we move forward. So.
Just in summary, then, the transfer agreement is with the operator, not necessarily the owner of the property.
Owner of the real estate.
Thank you.
Other questions or discussion? Do we take action on this item?
Before we make a motion, I am excited to see that we have two local businessmen that are our first ones to step forward and do this. I think that's important, and we appreciate that. Appreciate them doing that. So with that, I'll make a motion that we approve resolution number 18-7630, authorizing the mayor to execute the transferee agreement with Salina 2020 Inc. and the Barillo Grill / JKSK Corp.
Second. Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
nay.
1 nay. The resolution will pass 4-1. I believe that brings us to 7.6.
Yeah, actually, we postponed 7.1 to.
Oh, we skipped 7.1. Forgive me. Let's go back. That's important.
It's a thick one.
7.1.
I think it's all ties together.
Item 7.1, second reading, ordinance number 18-10984, authorizing the issuance of senior special obligation revenue bonds, Series 2018A, and subordinate special obligation revenue bonds, Series 2018B.
This ordinance was passed on first reading on November 5th, 2018, and since that time, no comments have been received. Are there any further comments from the public?
If I may, I add some additional comments. On November 5th, we described the bond structure and the sizing, and we acknowledged that between first reading and second reading, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the supporting documentation. Bond counsel has provided those. You received a draft copy of those, beginning of last week, I believe, and then they're also attached in the packet. They are still stamped draft. There's remaining blanks to be filled in terms of dates and dollar amounts, but if you have any questions about the specifics of those documents or any remaining information to be filled in, I'd have to rely on Gary Anderson from Gilmore and Bell. And then we had quite a bit of conversation about just kind of the senior and subordinate nature of the bond issuance, the fact that the city is not being asked to back either bond issuance, and then ultimately our bond underwriters, our specialized bond underwriters, Stifel, will take this issue to the market. That will determine the interest rate, which will determine the senior bond sizing, which will then determine the subordinate bond sizing. And then lastly, Blue Beacon's agreed to purchase the subordinate bonds at an agreed upon interest rate that's equal to the highest interest rate associated with the long-term bonds in the senior issue, but that is noticeably less than the premium rate that subordinate bonds might otherwise get on the open market. So having said that, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them or quickly defer to our consultants that are here to help in that regard.
Just for someone who might be watching television, can you give a rough idea as to, or the latest date at which the blank dates and amounts would be filled in on these documents? Just using your crystal ball.
Gary Anderson, Gilmore and Bell Bond Counsel for the city. So the current schedule is that assuming you approve the bond ordinance tonight on second reading, the preliminary official statement, which is the offering document, would be printed tomorrow, and approximately 2 weeks or so after that, the underwriter, which is Stifel, would price the bonds, which means the numbers would be final at that point. The numbers would then all be inserted into the documents at that point, executed by the city and the other related parties. And then I think closing is estimated around the 20th? Yeah, December 20th. So it would be a couple of weeks from now before we would have the final numbers. We got draft numbers again from Stifel today, but of course the numbers are subject to adjustment based on market conditions when they finally price them.
Thank you.
I've got a few questions. I'm not quite sure who to direct them to, so I'll just direct them in this general direction. And I do apologize. I was not here for, I think it was the November 5th meeting, and so if I'm plowing old ground, I do apologize on that. As I was reading through some of the agreements, the bond trust indenture, I noticed that there was a debt service reserve fund, and I was not sure what the debt service reserve fund, do we have like payments put aside for like the first couple of years or something like that? Or I just wasn't quite sure if that was something that we were going to have to fund in like perpetuity of the project, or is this something that just has a one-time deposit made in it and we just draw from that?
Well, let me
jump in with one thing. The total bond sizing is $23.5 million to net $18.5. So there's additional costs and considerations factored into that total bond sizing, including the debt service reserve funding. And Gary can speak to the mechanics of that more specifically.
So there, as part of the bond issue, because remember these are unrated, unenhanced revenue bonds. So the only source of repayment for bondholders is the star bond revenue that gets created over the 20 years. So you might imagine they're higher risk and things that can happen unexpectedly. So it is very customary to have a debt service reserve fund for these type of projects, and typically it's roughly about 10% of the bond issue. So right now that's estimated to be 1.3 million, because they're only doing 18 months, so they're not doing the max you would normally see on a lot of things. In addition, there will be a separate fund called the Capitalized Interest Fund, because given that, for example, the hotel, which is the initial biggest generator, won't open estimated December of 19, and it'll take 60 to 90 days before STAR revenues sort of start to flow. Well, investors want to get paid interest on their bonds when they buy them on December the 20th. So the capitalized interest will be there to pay interest on the bonds until there is sufficient revenue available. The debt service reserve fund is there, and in a perfect world, it will just sit there until maturity, and then at maturity it will be used to help pay the final maturity of the bonds. If for some reason there is an interruption in revenues and there are insufficient revenues to repay principal or interest at any time, if there are no other revenues available, the trustee will draw on the debt service reserve fund to make that payment. Then in the future, the way the waterfall, as we call it, the way the revenues work, that reserve fund would be replenished over time if there are sufficient revenues. So let's say it was, unfortunately, a fire somewhere that shut down Yayas for 12 months. So it's a temporary interruption. Hopefully things would get back on track and it would recover. So that's why it's there to cover unexpected events.
But right, and I'm just not a municipal finance or bond person, so, but that fund is replenished, meaning if for some reason that we were to draw down on that account in order to make our payments to the bondholders that we need to make, let's say we get down, to zero, then are we going to need to make an allocation from the city's budget to
No.
bring that back up?
No,
I
the
mean,
only
so we-
source of replenishment for the reserve fund and paying bondholders is STAR revenues.
Okay, thank you very much. Because as I was reading through that, I wasn't sure if it got replenished or if it was a one-time fund setup that we used. I guess something that I'd like to go back to that we talked about when former city manager Jason Gage was here, in terms of defaulting on bonds. The city of Salina has never defaulted on general obligation bond, special bond, anything like that, correct? I mean, we've never, at
To my
least in
knowledge, there's
institutional
never been a default
memory
on
in
any
this room.
GO or
Right.
city revenue bonds.
When Mr. Gage was here, he had sort of, at least in my mind anyway, created almost like I don't know if moral equivalency is the right term, but basically had indicated that it didn't matter whether or not the city actually backed the bonds, we would have a moral imperative to make those bonds good. In the event that payments couldn't be made to the bondholders on this, I mean, what happens next?
Let me answer that in a different way, Commissioner. And I would answer it this way, which is, in the unlikely event that occurred, that let's just say there was a tornado and came through and wiped out the revenue generators, there's
Right.
nothing to repay them. And there's no source of revenue to repay, and you have a default. There's a failure to pay principal and or interest on the bonds. There is no legal obligation of the city to cover that. So then the second question would be, well, would that have any impact on our rating related to our GO or our revenue bonds? Now, fortunately, we've never had, to my knowledge, any STAR bonds default in Kansas yet. We have had TIF, TDD, and CID bonds default. And what typically happens, because we have been involved in some of these, is the rating agencies will ask some questions about why was there a default. And what they're prying is not that they expect the city to cover it, because these are usually project-specific financings. They're examining whether there's a larger economic issue that could affect the city's GO bonds or revenue bonds. I.e., did your largest employer in the city just shut down and lay everybody off, and that might have an impact on your GO and revenue bonds. Not that XYZ retailer shut down because they're closing all their stores in their country because they're going bankrupt. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. You don't want to, of course, none of us ever want to have a bond default with your name on it. But I wouldn't be overly concerned about it from the standpoint of having any impact on your rating and your ability to sell your traditional GEO and revenue bonds.
So if I could, can you hear me on the wireless mic? Is that picking me up? I guess they're getting a hissing sound off of my desk mic.
Quit hissing.
If I could add a couple of things, the sizing of the senior bond corresponds to the revenue study projections. So in terms of default, Roger or Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's essentially intended to be right size for the financial projections. The subordinate bonds are being bought by a sophisticated buyer, which is a known financial term, and we know who that sophisticated buyer is, and they're doing so knowingly. And so there's kind of a cascade of order of defaults if that should occur. And so in the event that we don't if the project doesn't fully perform, it's going to start with the subordinate bonds and the sophisticated buyer that bought them full well knowing the risk associated with that purchase. We really have to do quite a bit of a failure or a default to get to the senior bond.
Yeah, I think one important thing to remember, and I think Mike mentioned this earlier about the purchaser of the subordinate bonds is quite honestly giving a really good deal, is not only is their interest rate going to be the same rate as the highest rate on the senior bonds, the subordinate bonds do not get paid any principal until the senior bonds are all paid off. So the subordinate bonds are roughly about $4.2 million right now, and the other, whatever it is, 19, 20 million is senior bonds. So you have an additional cushion, as I think Mike was suggesting with respect to this default question, is you got the subordinate bondholders down here that are a shock absorber on the likelihood of default. The default is going to be subordinate bondholders aren't going to get paid first if something really bad happens.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just, as I'm going through this, I just want to make sure I understand, because I was a little bit confused about the message that we got earlier about there being a moral imperative to go ahead and pay these bonds off. And I just want to make sure that by our decision today, we're not obligating, future commissions to, to cover our check, so to speak.
And not to interrupt you, but if I could add to that, there certainly was that conversation. There was the development agreement also spoke to a commercially reasonable backing of bonds, and recognizing that was not necessarily a defined term. And then Mr. Edgar had very detailed written discussion of the risks and the city's obligations, implied and actual obligations, similar to what Mr. Anderson described, and we had quite a bit of conversation then. So
thank you all for indulging me to revisit that since I wasn't there for that.
Sure, and Roger spent a lot of time on the front end addressing this topic, and I'd like to give him an opportunity to speak to that.
I'm actually glad this question got answered or asked. There was a lot of discussion early on in this project about whether or not, once we got to this point, whether or not the city would be asked to further credit support the bonds from your at-large sales tax or just general funds that would otherwise be available for the city's budget. And had you been asked to do that, then that would have been in fact something that I would refer to as a moral obligation to support the bonds if there was a shortfall in revenues. But you're not being asked to do that today. And I would, and you're correct that early on there were discussions about, whether we made that moral commitment or not, if at the time of issuance, if later on down the road there was a default, would we still feel that moral commitment? Well, that moral commitment, if you made it, would be embodied in written language in the documents. And it's not in these documents. So my advice to you would be that you're not making that moral commitment in this issue. The interest rates and the documents and the reflect that, and the purchasers who are purchasing the bonds know that. And I wouldn't. We've seen actually some circumstances where, county commissions or city commissions who have issued these bonds have started speculating about what they might or might not do if a default happened, and started talking about things that were or were not in the documents or behaving differently than the documents, and they've gotten themselves into problems with the rating agencies. And I would say that the way this has worked out is great from my perspective as your advisor. It's a very good result, because you're not being asked to further credit support the bonds. This project is freestanding. It's secured only by and stands only on the self-success of the project itself. And if anything changes, that's really up to a future commission to ask itself those questions, and I wouldn't go there right now. I don't think a future commission would need to either. Frankly, it would just be their choice if they decided to at that time, based on some other facts that we don't know today.
Thank you. That's exactly the kind of reassurance that I was looking for in terms of what we're obligating, what our obligations would be, and then in the event of a tornado or a natural disaster and a bond default, how that would impact our credit rating at that time. So, thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Any other questions?
Commissioner, I think I interrupted you in the middle of questions. If you're done, I acknowledged it previously, and I'll acknowledge it again. I wish I could tell you that as your staff or as your team, we drove a hard bargain and negotiated to this position, but Blue Beacon recognized the totality of the situation and the finances, and stepped up and agreed to buy the subordinate bonds and put us in a position to not have to back them, and I just can't overstate the significance of that.
Thank you, then. Can we bring this back up here for action, please?
Mr. Mayor, I make a motion we, on second reading, pass ordinance number 18-10984.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. We'll have a roll call, please.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. 7.1 passes 5-0. We'll move on down to the agenda to 7.6.
Item 7.6, receive and review the 2016 and 2017 audit reports from Meishauser and Company.
Ms. Pack.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. I provided you with some lovely reading over the weekend. I'm sure you all enjoyed it. We're glad to have provided that, believe me. I did want to draw attention that the opinion of the auditors is on page 1, and I'll ask Audrey Oderman, who's a representative of Meishauser, to address that here in just a minute. I just wanted to make note, too, that, as you know, these documents are very extensive, and there are certain sections that I would draw your attention to. That opinion on page 1, the management discussion and analysis on page 4, which kind of goes through what happened to our finances throughout the year and kind of why those things happened. The government-wide financial statements on page 16 and 17, and then the notes to the financial statements beginning on page 31. One thing I wanted to highlight for you, because I know it's been at the top of our minds as we talk about bond ratings and we talk about our financials, is what's going on with the general fund balance. So I did want to draw your attention to page 22 on both of the audits. It's on page 22. The general fund balance in 2016 on a budget to actual basis increased $178,000, and in 2017 increased $1.6 million. Oh, that was on the GAAP basis, sorry. and $192,000 in 2016 and $1.85 million on a budget basis. And I wanted to explain that the reason that it jumped in 2017, as you recall, we did get the $1.2 million sponsorship for TPAC, and we also did start our commitment from sales tax to that fund. So that's kind of why we're seeing that bigger increase, and those are things that the bond rating agencies are looking for. We were not subject to a federal audit, single audit this year related to federal grant dollars for either 2016 or 2017. And the other thing I wanted to point out, as you will see with some of these letters that you received, is that as an integral part of the audit, the auditors review internal controls of all of our departments. They want to look to make sure that we have practices in place that are going to protect us from anything that's going to go on. And one of the departments, of course, that has a very high volume for us is municipal court. So in its quantity that it does, it requires a little bit of an in-depth review. So during their field work in both 2016 and 2017, the auditors made several recommendations to improve the internal controls and also to create some efficiencies in municipal court. And you can see from the letters we did talk to municipal court management, and we have been working with them and recognizing these recommendations, and we did respond to those in the management response to the audit comments. So that's a single page. That's our response to them saying, we understand what you're saying, and this is what the steps we're going to make to try to alleviate these control issues. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Audrey Oderman. She is from Mize Hauser, to basically just give her overall opinion from their perspective on our audits.
I'm never going to be able to live up to what you just talked about, so I'll try. All right. So my name is Audrey Oderman, and I'm with Mize Hauser. We worked on the audit for 2016 and 2017. I'm going to go over each of those, talk about some of my favorite parts in the financial statement, and then answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to start with 16 and talk a little bit about, Debbie stole a little bit of my thunder, but that's okay. We're going to start on page 1. This letter talks about management's responsibility over the financial statements because they're your financial statements. And then it talks about our auditor's responsibility over the financial statements, the auditing standards that we use. And you'll notice on page 1 that there's a really big paragraph there, and it talks about some different component units that are included in these financial statements. So, and we reference the work of other auditors because we do not audit their work, but we do include them in the financial statements. So you'll see some information in that paragraph there. In 16, you'll see it's the first year that Qualic B was included in the financial statements as a blended component unit, and so there's a discussion on that very first page there. But what everybody wants to hear is the opinion, and so that's on page 2, and it's about the third paragraph in. It's a kind of a big run-on sentence because accountants apparently don't use grammar well. So, but it talks about the different components of the financial statements and each of those components receiving an opinion. So they've received each component has received an unmodified opinion, which is the highest opinion the financial statements can receive. The city worked diligently with us through this audit and has implemented a lot of the control procedures that we've suggested, and so they've received an unmodified opinion. That doesn't talk about the work that they do when we're just out here for the audit, but the work that they do throughout the year. I do also want to talk about that emphasis of matter paragraph right under the opinion, and what that's talking about is a restatement. So this isn't changing the opinion on the financial statement, it's just pointing out that there was a restatement in the net assets due to capital assets, and there's a further discussion in note 3 to the financial statements. Okay. Then I want to move on to the management discussion analysis, starts on page 4. This, I think, is one of the best parts of the financial statement because it's the only place where we show current year numbers and prior year numbers and allows management to do an analysis of the changes that occurred throughout the year. So there's tables in here, one's on page 8 and one's on page 9, that show the differences from one year to the next year, and then management has done an analysis. I will say, Debbie does a great job on this. A lot of times we get these back from management in their very summary form, and she has a lot of detail in here and talks really about the different transactions that occurred. So I strongly encourage you to really look at that part of the financial statements. I think it's a very good read. If we go on to page 16 and 17, this is the only part of the financial statements that's going to look as close to a business financial statement as you're going to get, because it brings the whole city onto 2 pages, basically a balance sheet and an income statement for the whole city. So if you want to see the finances of the entire city, these are the pages to look at. And if you see over on the right-hand side on page 16, those are some of those component units that I talked about. So they're operated outside the city, but are pulled into the relationship with the city. And then I'm going to skip way forward because this is hands down the best part of the financial statements. That's on page 102, and that's where the stats section starts. For an information junkie, this is the place to look because there's 10 years of very detailed information in here, not just financial information, but demographic changes within the city. And I think it's just a really interesting part of the financial statement, and I know it's very useful when when the city is issuing bonds. This is a really vital piece of the financial statement as well. Okay, so that's 16. And we're going to move forward to 17. Pretty similar financial statement. There's a couple little changes that occurred due to some accounting pronouncements that the city implemented. We're going to start again on the auditor's report, and we'll just skip to the opinion this time. And that's on page 2. Again, it's an unmodified opinion. So that's the best opinion that the financial statements can receive. You'll note that there is not an emphasis of matter paragraph on this one because there was not a restatement in 17. Okay? So the beginning net assets equaled the ending net assets from the year before, no restatements. And then again, starting on page 4 is the management discussion and analysis. So again, I encourage you to read that. 16 and 17 are the pages that show the city all together in one part of the financial statement. This time I want to talk a little bit about some note disclosures, and the first one starts on page 65. So there was a new accounting pronouncement that was issued that requires the city to put all of their tax abatement agreements within the financial statements. They don't record a liability or an asset, but it's just an informational only piece of the financial statement. So you can see all of the different types of tax abatements that the city has issued all in one note disclosure. And what we've come to realize in talking to different bond counsel and financial advisors is really the importance of this note disclosure isn't just for you to read and know what the agreements are, but also to really analyze those agreements to make sure that the city is in compliance with those. And so this is going to be a continued part of the audit every year and a continued note disclosure every year. And as we have more and more clients that are issuing these types of agreements, it's very important for the public to know that you're adhering to those agreements. So this note disclosure has that information. If we would note any violations of the agreements, it would be in this note disclosure as well. Okay, and you're not going to see any of that language within that part. Okay, then I'm going to go back a little bit to 63, and this is the post-employment benefit, post-employment health care plan. So this note disclosure is very similar to what you've seen every other year. The only reason I'm pointing it out is next year there's going to be a new accounting standard that is going to be issued that's going to pretty drastically change how this note disclosure reads. It's going to talk a lot about healthcare trends and the discount rates that the actuary uses, and fluctuations in what this liability could become depending on healthcare trends. So it's going to be a very different looking note disclosure next year, and I just want you to be aware of that and get ready for that, some of that information, the changes that note disclosure is going to bring. Okay. All right, and then the stats section again is in the back of the financial statements. We really enjoyed working with Debbie and her staff. They treat us very professionally when we come out here, get us all the information that we need, so we really appreciate that. Do you have any questions for me?
On the healthcare where you discussed the disclosure, does that affect any of our funding, or is it just a different way that we're required to report our liability?
So it shouldn't affect any of your funding at all.
Okay.
It really is just going to calculate the liability a little bit differently, and it's going to disclose some information where it's going to say, okay, well, if the healthcare trend is a 9% increase over 20 years, the liability would be this.
Is that a national health trend or our health trend?
It would be, it's based on, it's multi-factor. So it's your information and the industry information, as well as a look at the national changes. So it's kind of a combination of those things. But what it'll show is it a 9% increase? It'll be this liability. If it's 15, it'll be this. It'll just provide more information to show you fluctuations just depending on that analysis.
This may be more detailed than we need, but you might speak to the post-employment aspect of that liability being reported. And
So statutorily, you're required to allow your retirees to stay on your health insurance plan until they're CAPERS eligible. And so that's why you have to record that liability. You don't actually, the likelihood of you ever paying that out is really zero. You're not going to develop a trust to pay that liability down or have that cushion there. But it's just an estimate of the subsidy, meaning that if you have a 25-year-old healthy person, they would normally pay this rate. If you have a retiree and they went out and tried to get health insurance on their own, they would probably pay a substantially different rate. And so it's just an applied rate subsidy, meaning you're subsidizing the health insurance costs of those retirees, and that liability is that subsidy. Okay? It's not anything that you're going to, again, pay out in your financial statements, but it does need to be recorded in your financial statements.
Okay, we are looking at audit 2016 and 17. This is 2018. Are we not going to see the next audits and 18 and 19 until we get into 1920 again, or are we're going to okay?
So
that was what I was looking for, Debbie.
I assure you, Debbie does not want that to happen. So we have plans right now for us to come out here and work on the audit in April, with the idea that we're completely done by the end of May. Okay, some of that is contingent upon some of the component unit work as well, but that's the plan right now.
That timeline in and of itself is
different.
Is more expedited than in the past, let alone 2 audits in 1 year. So
Yes.
We're getting back on track.
Okay.
I have one quick question for you. Where in like the statistical section would we find like what percentage of our budget that we are relying on debt to fund? Does that question make sense to kind of see a historical trend as to?
So, if you go on page, not so much debt, but if you go on page 104, it'll show you, it'll kind of in the middle of the page, it shows net expense, net expense revenue, and that's taking into account your expenses plus any charges for services, and that's saying, okay, well, that's where your fund balance is before any of your tax money kicks in. Okay, and then after that, you see the tax money and how much tax money you have to generate to sustain your fund balances. Okay, that note really doesn't talk about bond proceeds.
Okay.
Really at all, but that's where it's at. And there are different places where it shows bond proceeds compared to your assessed valuation.
Right.
And those start on page 108.
Right. I was just reading an interesting article about the varying percentages of city budgets that are accounted for, with debt, and I was just kind of curious to see where we fell in the in line with that. So
that's not in here. It might be in an official statement. Some of that additional information when you issue bonds might be in there. Thanks.
What? Sorry, Debbie. I forget I said that.
And I guess the one thing that I have a question about, and because you always look at the notes, and that's where you go to, because all those numbers kind of, for us, kind of blend together. But dealing with the municipal court, I'm guess this is a question for Debbie. We're addressing the issues we have, and does that fall upon the fact that we're short-staffed, or is it just a setting up a better system?
Well, and I have municipal court here, so they can answer for themselves if they'd like. But there has been some changes in their software. There has been changes in the police department software. A lot of the issues that, from what I understand, and I'm not from municipal court, but police officers are out there issuing tickets on electronic ticketing software. That information is uploaded into municipal court. So there's already 2 software pieces there, so it's kind of just getting all those pieces put back together and figuring that out. There has been some short staff issues over there, but I think we're addressing those, and they're addressing those very well. And we have, like I said, we've come up with a lot of ideas on how to kind of address some of the issues that we found. Did you guys want to add anything else? Do you want more information?
I guess I would offer the primary takeaway is it's noted, there's coordination ongoing, and we're looking at
And that's what
addressing it
audits
going
are for,
forward.
is to find those
That's
and
exactly
to
right.
address them and
And I will
to
say
correct
from
them
my
and move forward.
past
right?
experience, that's how you do, that's why we have auditors, to
Right,
come in and tell us where they see some concerns, and then as management, we need to address those concerns, and sometimes we can't. I mean, especially in a city that's this small, a lot of the issues will be that you need a separate person to do every little task. Well, you don't have that many people, so you have to come up with some ways to do that. And so I think we are addressing those very well.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you for all your work and for catching us up.
Glad to be there. So we will need a separate motion to accept each year individually. I will just make that note, if you want to know.
Okay, we're ready. Mayor Ryan, I move we approve the 2016 audit report for Mize, Hauser and Company.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
Do we need to ask for public comment first?
Is there any public comment?
And I just thought of one more question. Did we approve the 2015 audit? Did we? I'm looking at, did we? Okay, I couldn't remember.
As far as I know, I haven't.
Okay. Okay, cool.
I will make a note, too, that as soon as you accept this, it will go online. It's not out there yet, but I want you to accept it first.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We'll accept that 2016. Is there a motion for 2017?
Mayor Ryan, I move that we accept 2017 audit report from Mize, Hauser and Company.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Commissioners, I did want to take the opportunity to acknowledge this is, Debbie recently celebrated her one-year anniversary with the city, and she walked into an exceptional challenge as it related to software and finances and staff transition and these audits. And so I've been very impressed how she's picked things up quickly and hit the ground running, and I've never seen her in anything but a positive attitude to tackle all the stuff she found on her plate when she walked in the door. So feels pretty good to
Happy
hear this
anniversary.
point.
And welcome to Salina, and I hope we can present you further challenges, but of a good variety.
Commissioner Hodges already tried. So.
Yeah.
7.7.
Item 7.7, resolution number 18-7634, authorizing the mayor to execute addendum number 2 to the license agreement for sculpture display in the public right-of-way with the Salina Area Chamber of Commerce.
Mr. Anderson.
Hello, Mayor and Commissioners. Came to our attention recently when we were looking at moving a piece of sculpture in conjunction with the downtown construction that's going on, the one that's currently on display, that we have a relatively small footprint in the license agreement that had been acted with the Chamber of Commerce and the Sculpture Tour Salina organization. A little bit of background, they have for 8 years been placing sculpture in the right-of-way in cooperation with Public Works and Engineering and the other departments. Consulting, Salina Arts and Humanities has served as a resource partner as well, and it's worked very well. Well, in conjunction with the construction that's going on, with the redesign of some of the plazas and the designs of the downtown that you've already approved that include some spaces for sculpture either in a permanent way or temporarily each year in this action or in this program, that we needed to bring the map up to date. So before you today is a couple of the previous resolution and an adjustment to that. This will be the third time in the 8 years that the map has been adjusted. So with Jim's staff's help, we went to a larger footprint. Iron Avenue from Front Street to 9th, or to 8th, and then, no, 9th, I believe, yeah. And then 5th, Santa Fe, and 7th Street in what really equates to most of the Starbond district. So this doesn't mean that you're approving a significant shift of 80 pieces coming to downtown Salina in the near future, but it does give us the freedom and flexibility as a city to communicate with the representatives of the Chamber and Sculpture Tour and SDI on the best placement and sequencing of that through this process. So with that, I will stand for questions.
Questions? If there are none, thank you very much. Anyone from the public like to address this item?